I was one of the three people who were involved in trying to raise money for a Centre for Disability in the Arts. I was in charge of the art program at Leicester University in the adult education department. We had opened a studio, had quite a lot of interactive connection with various art courses, but we hadn't done anything with disability, and it was suggested that we did. So very, very able person who had been a student and was also a very good artist, Rachel Sullivan, decided to take on the job of disability in the arts. And she started a program called Touch and See, which was really had to do with art for the blind. And she really was thinking, we want these people not to do third-rate art and say, isn't that lovely, dear, you're blind, but to actually act the way that all art students do, so that they're really involved in making a work. If it isn't any good, you start over again. You don't pat them on the head and say, you're lovely because you're disabled. And that kind of thought was the basis of the whole thing, discipline, taking people where they are. Now, we'd been teaching that way into a high degree in terms of adult education before, but it was specifically here about, in the first place, blind and then disability. After a while, it became clear, Eleanor Hartley, who became the director, and the other two of us were associate directors, was in charge of special needs. And so the idea came together that maybe we could have just a slightly larger building, perhaps a little sort of shed built next to the area we were using before. And we talked to the Vice Chancellor, who said, no, that land was reserved for something else, but we might consider thinking about a building. And we were slightly shocked that the carte blanche was, I think, given with genuineness, with also, I suspect, the presumption that we couldn't get anywhere. But I don't think it was cynical, but I don't think it was necessarily optimistic. And what happened then is we hovered around and talked about a Getty Centre and various things like that, and hadn't found anything. And I think Eleanor may have already told you that her husband heard about Richard Attenborough's interest in disability, and she had a meeting with him in a French restaurant in London, and that's where it started. So one day Richard came up, he comes up in his Rolls Royce with his secretary and his personal assistant, Diana Hawkins, who played a big part in the whole thing. And here we meet him at his Rolls Royce, and he is incredibly amiable. And that's where I met him, and I can't remember the first time, but it happened many, many times after that. He was always gentle and awesome at the same time. Very, very amiable, very unpretentious, but wearing the cloaks of royalty, and he was, in a basic sense, royal, and he didn't need to do anything about it. That's just who he was. Well, one of the things that was marvelous is what happened is we were working with the administration of the university, who was in favor of what was happening, but they didn't do things this way, because Richard came to all the meetings, or all the major meetings, and that was fine. But Richard would meet us, who were mere lecturers. We were not even heads of department. And we would meet him ahead of time for breakfast somewhere. And we'd chat with him at length, and he would ask us what we wanted to do about this, that, and that. Now, he didn't listen, he didn't take on everything we said, but he was listening always. He wasn't just making it up. And if we had an issue, we raised it. And he would take us into these meetings, which we weren't supposed to be in, because this isn't the way the universities work. And we would keep relatively quiet, and he would say to the Vice Chancellor, don't you think it would be absolutely marvelous if we did this and this and this, which we'd been talking about in the morning? And how could you refuse him? He was a politician. He knew how to use words. He knew what he could ask for and what he can't, and if we'd said, I think we ought to do that, that would just fall on nothing would happen. So he was very, very discerning and strategic. And of course, that meant also that he got a wonderful group of names as patrons. on our letterhead. So if any of you were thinking of giving money, you couldn't possibly have doubted that it was okay. So it was that kind of thing. He knew the grassroots, and he also knew the power people. Well, I think the centre is changed to some degree. It was built as a Centre for Disability in the Arts, but before it was built, it was called, we asked him if it could be the Richard Attenborough Centre for Disability Arts, and he genuinely, humbly said yes. I think he was quite shattered in a way, genuinely. I know he's a good actor, but I think it was a real thing. And I think he was very touched to be asked. So he put a huge amount into that. And that was over a period of about 10 years. And there was a lot, again, again, we've had the Paralympics now, so the whole disability scene has changed. But that was a period when the disability scene was changing, and he was helping to make marks in that. So he really does care about the place, and actually that makes a difference. And again, we had a lot of events. We had, he'd turn up at a lot of them. You'd have a reception, and if it were somebody else, of course, it would have been 50 people, and it was 200 with him, and it really buzzed. And these were people who would help. So there was that thing. He is, I think, a figurehead, as is his brother in the city. I think he's another Richard at the moment, of course, and I don't know whether anyone put the two together, but it does make a nice bit of publicity. I don't think they've done it yet, but I hope they will. Well, I think he's a successful, amiable, kindly, intelligent, profound person who's come very much out of Leicester. And his schooling was in Leicester, so he represents Leicester brilliantly. And I don't know what the city will in the fullness of time do, but you can't really get a better sort of representative than that. Oh well, of course, the best one, but you probably had this already, is the opening story with Diana, and of course that's the thing that hits the bit. It was incredible because we hadn't ever gone through this thing where you had a celebrity and royalty or semi-royalty coming, and we had gone through all the process. It was a really grilling thing. So anything that happened affected everybody in the building. But when we finally got to the opening, it was extraordinary because everybody came, and we had the story, which you probably heard of, the red helicopter coming and landing on the field across from there, and out comes Richard. Richard goes across the lawn and meets Diana, and that's very hard to forget. It's comic and tragic and everything else, but that, and then there were people camped on the steps doing that kind of thing, and that was very, very fascinating. And for us, it was such a big production, even though this is a very tiny place. It was such a symbolic sense of success. It was also, for him, it was, I suppose when you're making films or acting in films to get to that stage, it must be terrific when it all happens, and that was the day. And actually, they hit the newspapers all over the world. I know some American newspapers had that Richard and Diana kissing or hand in hand going on across their paper. But it was a great achievement.